We're live.
Okay, everybody, welcome to Lecture 7 for Old Testament Survey. Before we get started tonight, I just want to let you know that right now I'm deciding pretty much that we're going to have a final of you writing out 2,000 to 3,000 words that would give basically a complete overview or highlight of everything that you have learned in Old Testament Survey. So with an open, and it's going to be open book. So with an open book, you must be organizing your notes very, very well, because I will grade that then on the basis of the notes. So if you've done a good job of organizing your notes, starting from lecture 1 to lecture 2, lecture 3, lecture 4, on into finally to the lecture 9, then writing out a 2,000 word to 3,000 word summary of the Old Testament Survey, you'll get all of the main points. And of course, keeping it at 2,000 to 3,000 words allows you to use some verbiage there, but it's going to demand that you be very, very focused. And so I'm always giving you handouts that show overviews, because I want you to get the big picture, and then you kind of take it from the big picture and you kind of narrow it down, and then begin to talk about more details. And so I'm going to do that for you tonight in this lecture. Keep in mind now, there's only 2 more lectures, lecture 8 and lecture 9, and I promise you both of them are going to be chock full. Lecture 9 is going to really be chock full with a lot of information. And the good news is that as time goes on and we do more and more classes, what we will do is we will focus in on things that we just, barely touched on. It's like, I believe next quarter, if it's not next quarter, it's sometime this year, maybe this is the last quarter, I will do a series, a lecture on just the prophets. So we've done Old Testament Survey, New Testament Survey, and then I will do prophets, where I just focus on all of the information that's there about in the Bible about prophets, who they are, sons of the prophets, school of the prophets, etc. The literary prophets, the non-literary prophets. But for right now, you're just getting an overview of all of that. So to start with tonight, what I want to do is I want to focus on an overview. And this kind of helps you understand, what do I mean when you're doing a final for me, an open book final, and I'm asking you to describe for me those things that you've learned. I really want to encourage you to understand, always start with the bigger picture and then you kind of focus down. And so what I want to show you here is something very, very important to helping us understand not only what's going on right now with the time period that we're in, but how we really begin to understand, the bigger picture of time periods and how we lock those down. And so what I call this as an overview from the call of Abraham, remembering that Abraham was 75 years old when he was called. So I call this an overview from the call of Abraham to the exile in Babylon, or the exile of the southern kingdom in Babylon, when Nebuchadnezzar came down and destroyed Jerusalem and took the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which were primarily, it's led by Judah, but we can prove to you that all of the tribes were down there. And I might get to touch on that some, if not this time, next time, because we'll show you verses of Scripture that describe during the continual spiritual decline, and it was bad, because remember, I'm going to show you tonight, there were no righteous kings in Israel, in the northern kingdom. They were all wicked, but it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And so during that spiritual decline, the tribes began to fall out to Judah. They would come down and actually then find asylum, if you would, in Judah. And so by the time the northern kingdom is all exiled, and we call it the lost, the lost 10 tribes, by that time there was some of all of the 10 tribes in the southern kingdom. And so I try to make those points to help you understand that tonight. It's just that by and large, the majority of the 10 tribes were dispersed. And what we call it the diaspora. They were led away, as I told you before, by Sennacherib in about 721 BC. And he exported them to the countries that he chose, and then imported from other countries, other nations into the northern kingdom, and they ultimately became known as the Samaritans. Some of them were just foreigners, and some of them were foreigners that actually integrated with Jewish people of the northern kingdom. So there's a lot of things to say there. I don't want to get too sidetracked with it. Just want you to understand that we have evidence that all the representatives of all the northern tribes were in the southern kingdom. Remember, Elijah is going, well, maybe you didn't remember this. You're going to get it tonight if you don't know it already. Elijah was a prophet to the northern kingdom. And he, when he was saying, Lord, I'm the last person left, the Lord said, no, I've got how many? Like 6,000, right? Right? 7,000? Was it 6,000 or 7,000? 7,000. I always mess that up. 6,000 seems right to me, but it's actually 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal, who remained faithful to God. And so it's those kinds of folks that we know that the Lord took care of. They weren't punished with the wicked. They were taken care of. Father's always doing that. And then, once again, as I show you the divided kingdom again tonight, we have to remember that although God only left one tribe to David, to Judah, the southern kingdom, it was almost immediately that all of Benjamin was also included in that. So it was Judah and Benjamin. And, there's different ideas about that, but we know certainly that in a very short time, for whether it was a confederacy or whether it was a conquest, because Benjamin would have been a border as a tribe or nation tribe between the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. So I know that's quite a bit of information, and what I'm holding you responsible for more than anything are those things that you have in your notes that I've given you as handouts. And hopefully some of you are able to take some notes in addition to what I'm giving you as handouts, and you're able to pin in really what does this really mean, and what is it that I'm saying. Then that's going to be a great asset to you when you're taking the final. And by and large, you're going to have to interpret what I'm saying, all of the graphs and all the handouts. So if you haven't done a good job at that, and you look at those graphs and you look at those handouts and those tables, and you're not really sure what they mean, then you better partner up with somebody who is sure what they mean, okay, before the last lecture. Because we have the 9th lecture, then what we do almost immediately, what we do is we immediately the next week start the next quarter. And so you've got between lecture 9 Old Testament survey, for example, and lecture 1 of I believe what I'm going to be doing for you is Gifts of the Spirit 101. You have just that 1 week to do your final, get it turned in. And so keep that in mind. And we've squeezed it down like this so that we could have a shorter school period, because we recognize that everybody's doing this at night, and we're not running a full-time school in the day yet. We will eventually. We'll have full-time day school and we'll have night school, but this is where we're starting. So without further ado, let me just go in here and get back to this. And then what you've got to remember, and of course I'm saying this repetitively, is that from the call of Abraham to Exodus, it's 430 years. And that's what you're held responsible for. And so that is at 18, 73 BC. And then, of course, I just want to call this to your attention because it's very, very important. Then 75 years before that is the birth of Abraham in 1948. And I want you to keep in mind this one thing, and that is that we have really good, accurate dating for the history of man in the Bible, just except for this period of time that's right in here, the Exodus to the Kings, okay? And if we ever come up short on something, we always just kind of pull from here or subtract from here, okay? Either add to here or pull from here. But, you know, and we'll have a class that will eventually go through all the exercises that many people have attempted to, you know, elucidate really and account for accurately these years. But what I want you to really, what I really want to point out to you is that this time period is our time period which we know the least about in terms of giving an accurate space of time. Very important. When it comes to the call of Abraham to Exodus, we got it. When it comes from the call of Abraham, or rather from the Exodus to the 4th year of King Solomon's rule, well, we got it, right? 1 Kings 6:1, we got it. I want you to remember stuff like that. It's very important because I want you to come out of Old Testament survey with the ability to give it a defense for the Word of God. I don't do Old Testament survey like it was like I took it in 1981, okay, at Point Loma Nazarene College. Because I just assume everybody knows all the Bible stories. You got those as a kid, and if not, you've got them now. I can tell you about how many animals got into the ark, and I can tell you about how the sequence in which Jacob had his children and which wife had them. I don't think that that's really what you need. You can get Bible stories all day long. What you really want to do is get into the details of what's going on in the Word of God and understand a chronology and a framework to more perfectly put things into position. Because we'll build on this for the next 4 years. And you'll be able to really understand the context of the prophets a whole lot more, because one of the things that I'm pushing you towards is both exegetical and hermeneutic studies, or hermeneutical exegetical studies, that then you have to really know context. You got to know what period of time this was taking place, what was going on around Israel at the time, information that we can derive from secular history, and this allows you to do that because you've learned this information well. So that comes back once again to your notes and organizing your notes. Keep those notes. You're going to be using them for the rest of your life. Make sure that you invest a lot into your notes. A notebook, and I didn't say this a lot when I got started because most of you have had some, at least undergraduate, and some of you a lot of postdoc stuff or postgraduate and even postdoc stuff. So you've learned that this is a very, very valuable asset to you, how you organize your notes, keep your notes. So, I'll just emphasize that a little bit more to you as I go along. But so what I want to do is I want to emphasize that the 430 years that we have as biblical information. I want to emphasize basically a time point here which you've gotten before from me, 4th year of Solomon's reign. You highlighted 480 years from the time they had come out of Exodus to the 4th year of his reign. Then we know primarily during this period of time, which is from King Saul to the divided kingdom, it's approximately 110 years because you've got Saul 40 years, okay? Then you got David 40 years, and you got about 40 years for Solomon. But what you have to keep in mind is that King David and King Solomon had a co-regency. Remember, Solomon got anointed king before David died because David's getting old, and there's other folks out there jumping the gun and trying to coronate another one of his sons. So important, okay, that you understand that was not 120 years, because you would say, well, 40, that's 120. It's 110 because we give 10 years co-regency, okay? You understand that? Now, at the end of that 110 years now, you just basically, there's one other thing I want to do. I want to show you one of the ways in which we squeeze this down is that we have an accurate period, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this tonight, an accurate genealogy and time frame for how long the northern kingdom lasted from the moment that it was divided and Jeroboam, an Ephraimite, became king over the northern kingdom to the time that Sennacherib destroyed it. We've got approximately 210 years, okay? And then from the time of the divided kingdom, which would have been under the reign of Rehoboam, which would have been Solomon's son, to the time that it was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar, it's, and once again, good chronology, and I'll show you some of that tonight, approximately 345 years. And then there's something else that allows us to get this date back here for the judges, okay? Once again, we're saying this is a tough and a most difficult time period to really calculate. So what, you know, and this is Exodus to the Kings. Remember, this has the time period of everybody in there from Joshua all the way to Samuel, okay? And of course Samuel overlaps with the Kings. So let me just put it to you this way. Clearly it has all of the time in there from Joshua to Eli. And important for you to remember that. Really important, okay? And so one of the other things that we do in order to really help us understand this time period is we look at these dates that we have that are really solid dates, okay? And that is from 1873 BC, which would have been the time of Abraham's call, to 586 BC. Those are good solid dates. We get those from biblical chronologies. We get those also confirmed up with other secular chronologies, like, you know, the Assyrian chronology, Babylonian chronology, to some degree the Egyptian chronology. And then it really allows us then to say, well, here's where we're at. Now, we got basically 402 years here with the Exodus to the Kings, and at some point in time in the future, as you become, you know, smarter and more well educated concerning Scripture, we'll break that 402 years down for you, because it's one thing that we do not do in Old Testament survey. It's a little bit too complicated. So this is a very important time period. You kind of overview so you can kind of understand how things are squeezed together, how that they fit, how that they actually fit very perfectly. Because if this 210 years, 345 years was off, then we wouldn't be able to account for, you know, the date of the final destruction of 586 BC for Jerusalem. You know, it wouldn't match up with respect to when Abraham's call was. So there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of different dates and variables, if you would, working here in this story, and this rather complex story. And ultimately you want all of the dates and events to coincide, no matter how you look at it, which way you go with it. So the next thing I want to do real quickly is I want to kind of just I want to highlight, before I talk to you about the kings, I want to go ahead and highlight during this period of time at the divided kingdom, at the time of the divided kingdom. So remember, Saul was the first king anointed over all the 12 tribes of Israel. And then, because of his rebellion and because of his disobedience, it was then went from the tribe of Benjamin and handed over to David in the tribe of Judah. Okay? And then God had swore to David that there would be one of his sons would sit on his throne forever. And God chose Solomon. But Solomon so disobeyed God, so violated the sacred things, that God took away 10 of the kingdoms from Solomon, and left him basically Judah and Benjamin. And so at the very beginning of the divided kingdom, we've got a lot of prophets prophesying. And I'm going to only focus for right now on the literary prophets. When I teach you the class on the prophets, I'm going to show you surrounding this is all these other non-literary prophets. In fact, some of them were literary prophets, like Yehud, but they aren't son of Iddu. But they're not extant. Those manuscripts aren't around anymore. And so there's a number of cases like that. And we'll go through those. We'll talk about them more. And we'll speculate, wonder where they're at. Someday they're going to turn up. Okay. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to talk to you about the literary prophets. Important for you to remember this. What's the difference between a literary prophet and a non-literary prophet? A literary prophet is one of those prophets that are in the Bible that has a book dedicated to it. A non-literary prophet is a prophet like Elijah or Elisha, who prophesied in the Bible, but they don't have any books. There's no book of Elijah. There's no book of Elisha. There's no book of Azariah and many other prophets that prophesied. So, in our sequence that we have, we start off with the oldest prophet, and the oldest book is Obadiah. And Obadiah is the smallest of all of the prophets. And it's a very radical, very small book, but a very radical description also of end-time events that are going to take place. Amazing. And then there's, like I said, there's other non-literary prophets around him. But Elijah overlaps Obadiah to some degree. And down here below in the x-axis, I'm showing you the time period. Okay? And one other thing I want to really point out to you about this overview of the literary prophets during the divided kingdom is I want to point out to you two important dates. 721, you see that exclamation mark? That's when the northern kingdom was destroyed. Okay? And so then you see the date 586? That's when the southern kingdom was destroyed. Now what I have here is I'm showing in blue, I'm showing the prophets for the northern kingdom. And in green, I'm showing you that they are prophets for the southern kingdom. You'll see in my handouts, if you just go through them and study them in detail, because I don't know how much time I'm going to actually have to devote to it, you'll see that most of the prophets, if they were northern prophets, they actually came from the northern region of Israel. Or if they were southern prophets, they came from the southern region of Judah. And there are exceptions. There are times where you have a southern prophet coming and prophesying to the northern kingdom and vice versa. But in both the case of literary and in non-literary prophets. And on those non-literary prophets, not all of them are named. Some of them the Lord just hid away. Okay, so then we have, so Obadiah, because he's in green, he's what? Southern prophet. And then we have Elijah, Elisha, then Joel, southern prophet. Then we have Jonah, Amos, and Hosea, prophet. This is a great time period right here. Look at all the overlap right here. This is a profound period of time of prophecy going on. And this is just the literary prophets. There's non-literary prophets surrounding them. I mean, there's a bunch of people prophesying. There's a period of time where you got Micah, Isaiah, and Hosea all prophesying together. And then, of course, Isaiah is one of the prophets who prophesied a very long span of time. And you can see here from about 750 all the way out to about 697. So Isaiah actually extended beyond the northern into extended beyond the time period of the existence of the northern kingdom into a time period after they were already destroyed. Important to look at and understand how Isaiah was prophesying. Isaiah is like a miniature Bible. It had just the whole of the Bible is 66 books. It's not to say that that's the template for canonization or why 66 books of the Bible were chosen. No, he's a miniature of the Bible, and we'll talk more about that when we're actually doing a class on the prophets. Another prophet that extended a long period of time that maybe some of you didn't realize this was Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied from 640 way past 586. I mean, come on, look how old he is. Okay? I mean, Jeremiah, I believe Jeremiah was called at 30, okay? So he's probably still prophesying at 90 years old. What a legacy, what a long-lasting ministry. It's rare that you ever see a ministry like that last so long, and especially a viable ministry, and especially in modern times. Of course, you know, when we think about Moses, how long did Moses' ministry last? Basically 40 years. That's a long ministry. Joshua was pretty much, you know, for the most part of his ministry was like 30 years. But Jeremiah, he's just an amazing prophet all the way around. So then we have, I think it's really important to look at the reality that we have Jonah, Amos, Hosea, all prophesying at the same time. Now, Jonah and Amos, just because I have them in this time period of prophesying, doesn't mean that they weren't still around. All these guys could have still been around. They were still influential. Jonah, we know, was influential not only as a prophet, but he was actually in the court of the king. He had actually a political role in Israel. And so he was not only a prophet, he had a political role. Talk about that more, as I was saying, when we actually do a class on the prophets. Then you've got, after the fall of the northern kingdom, you've got Nahum, Zephaniah prophesying alongside of Jeremiah. And also prophesying at the same time of Jeremiah is Habakkuk. And then ultimately, we'll get into this next time in Lecture 8, but Jeremiah is going to be around while both Ezekiel and Daniel are prophesying, and he kind of passes the baton to them. Okay? Are you with me? And so, like Lecture 8, we're going to really just focus on the time period of the diaspora, the time period in which Ezekiel and Daniel are prophesying, and then we'll pick up with that the last three prophets that are in existence as our group of prophets for the Old Testament, which will be Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah. And then that's it. Because right here, these are like 13 prophets. Count them up. Isn't it 13 right there? And then we got 5 remaining, right? Pretty much.
13.
There's 13, 5 remaining. That's it. So here we have 2 of our major prophets right there, Isaiah and Jeremiah, right? Then we have, what do we have left? We have Ezekiel and we have Daniel left. Okay? And then, of course, as I said before, the 12 are just, they're not called minor prophets in antiquity. They're just called the Scroll of the 12. Remember that? Don't forget that, Scroll of the 12. It was just later in time that they were referred to as minor prophets. And then once again, I want you to remember this. They're referred to as minor prophets because they just got short writings in comparison, to all the voluminous writing of Isaiah. Because Isaiah's scroll is bigger than the Scroll of the 12 put together. Are you with me? Keep that in mind. That helps you to conceptualize the difference between why we call them major prophets and minor prophets, because it certainly isn't their message. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to bring you to another chart here that I'm graphing out a little bit different for you in the x-axis. Because in the x-axis, what I'm really wanting to emphasize is the total number of year span for this divided kingdom before everybody's gone belly up. Are you with me? And, 341 years, that's not a long time. Well, you think about America. How long has America lasted now? America's what, 200 and, what is it?
280.
200 and, what are we, is it 210 years? When was our bicentennial? Help me. Okay? So it was,
76.
It was, what are we, guys? We're just a little, get to it.
240.
We're 214.
240.
41.
I'm sorry.
Just over
241 years. So we're just a little over 200 years. So 241, okay. And shows you how patriotic I am. But nonetheless, or it shows you how poor I am at math on the fly. Okay. So 341 years is, in comparison to how long the United States has lasted up to this point, well, that's pretty lengthy. Okay. And, you know, and as I was saying before, the Northern Kingdom lasted 210 years. So the Northern Kingdom lasted, try to kind of put this in perspective, the Northern Kingdom lasted basically up until what? That would be 1986, something like that, right? So in 1986, if the United States would have been destroyed or been no more, that would have been how long, you know, relative to how long the Northern Kingdom lasted. And that's kind of really what I'm trying to show you in this chart. So I'm saying at the rule of Jeroboam, starting year 1, it goes out to 344 at the time that now basically Jerusalem destroyed. Jeremiah and Habakkuk are prophesying. Okay? And I'm showing you a couple of things here that I didn't in the other chart, as I'm showing you just a couple of the non-literary prophets, like Ahiah, okay, or what we would say Ahijah. But for everybody that's taken Hebrew, introduction to Hebrew, you realize there's no J in the Hebrew language, and so it should be Ahiah, okay, and that's really, people need to take introduction they need to take an intro to Hebrew, just so they can learn how to pronounce biblical names properly. And then there's a prophet from Judah, and he's an unknown prophet from Judah, who comes up and prophesies to Jeroboam. Jeroboam reaches out to grab a hold of him, and his hand freezes up, right? He finds out he can't touch this guy. And one of the beautiful things, too, about that is the things that this prophet prophesied. We have another time period that really helps us there. Everything that he prophesied was not fulfilled until I think it was 280 years later, at the time of Josiah, the King Josiah, the revivalist. And that's really what I'm showing you in this graph. I'm really wanting to show you who was in rulership, highlights of who was in rulership. Not everybody, because I can't get it all on this graph. I'm just taking the guys that are most famous, okay? And so during Ahab and Jezebel, Elijah is prophesying. During Jeroboam II, this is a powerful time of prophecy. Hosea, Jonah, Amos, Isaiah, Micah, you know, Uzziah is down in the southern kingdom in Judah as king, and primarily he's being basically guided by, if you would, and is certainly corrected by Isaiah during that period of time. And then at the same time, and I've already gone over this, while Hezekiah is king, Hosea is prophesying, but now, as well as Isaiah, but now that Israel is destroyed, and destroyed in the time period of King Hosea. And and it's interesting, you know, the uniqueness of, you got a prophet Hosea and a king Hosea. But I think one of the most important things that I want to show here, and I didn't show all the non-literary prophets, as boy, was the Lord ever talking, was he ever warning them. He raised up mighty men of signs and wonders to tell these kings, you better get it right, you better turn from your wickedness. But they didn't hearken unto them. And so then we got to transition with Hezekiah and Isaiah. And of course, Hezekiah stands out. We really have two great kings in Judah, and both of them are truly revivalist kings. And I would really like to spend some time talking about the revival that both Hezekiah led and Josiah led, but I just really can't do it in the short time that we have for Old Testament survey, so I can just allude to it. But Hezekiah and Josiah, these are our two revivalist kings. These are the two really great kings in Israel. And then right after Hezekiah, we have absolutely the worst king in Judah. And that's why I have him here. The most evil king in Judah, and his name is Manasseh. And the terrible consequences of Manasseh's evil is that the Lord would constantly say that he was not going to repent or relinquish concerning Judah's judgment because of the sin of Manasseh and what Manasseh had taught all of the southern kingdom to do. And ultimately the southern kingdom became more wicked, and even by God's own testimony of them, they became more wicked in their deeds than Israel. And a lot of that was brought on by Manasseh. Manasseh was actually taken prisoner and led away into captivity, and while in prison cried out to God. He himself repented, came back into the mercies of God. God forgave him and restored him back to kingship. And his last few years of reign wasn't bad, but the wickedness that he had sowed was so evil. There was absolutely no restoring Israel or Judah because of his sins. And an intense story with many lessons to be learned from it. So I know I just have a few more minutes, so I want to try to just kind of explain to you a couple of other charts that you have, and I want to start with this one. And in this one, this chart really is just about dating. A lot of brilliant minds have gone into figuring out all of the chronology of the kings. People like Albright. Albright is the leading biblical archaeologist, Princeton University. I was very fortunate to actually be able to be a student of one of his proteges, which was Dr. David Noel Friedman, who is the editor of Anchor Bible Series and taught it in San Diego, at University of California, San Diego. And then you have Thiel, and you see Albright basically, he shows Jeroboam 1 right there at 922, okay? And then Thiel also is in the mix, and in his dating system, and just a brilliant man who came off the mission field, who was a missionary, and then devoted himself to biblical studies, especially in terms of the King's List and defining chronology. I think one of the great things about Thiel is that he actually made corrections in the Syrian chronology based upon the list of kings. And what happened, the story is vague to me because I learned it such a long time ago. And basically, the whole secular community balked at him because he was adjusting the Assyrian chronology, and the Assyrian chronology was to them the best thing that they had going. And I think Thiel was actually vindicated either 7 or 8 years after he died. There was new evidence brought forth in archaeology for the Assyrian kings, and everybody's got to go, oops, Thiel was right. So the Bible is a trendsetter, okay? Then you have Kitchen, and you can see there's not a lot of difference in these dates, you know. There are important differences, but, you know, Albright's got 922, Thiel's got 930, Kitchen's got 931, and then there's this guy, I can't pronounce his name, I think it's Litovitus. He's got it down to, his is 929. So you can see they're very, very close. And then I point out a couple, and there's some differences, and where they really have some differences would be right around this period of time. Hezekiah, they got a lot of differences there with Hezekiah. And then you can see here a very important period of time here, which is the fall of Samaria. It's refined, but there's not a lot of difference. And so, you know, this last guy, he's done a very, very good job, and he's being hailed as, you know, someone who's really refined the chronology list. What's the difference? 721 versus Kitchen 723. versus Seals 723 and versus Albright 722. Okay, so Albright was on it. Then what I want to show you here is this is just a real quick brief graph. This is not scaled because you can't get it all on one page if you scale it. And this just shows you the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel and the prophets that were alongside of them. So you see basically, once again, this is not scaled. It's a different time period. So we've got to be careful with that. Make sure you pay attention to the date. But what you'll do is you'll see a prophet like Elijah, and then you'll see, the time period in which kings were in Israel were affected by the ministry of Elijah and Elisha, and so on. And then this other handout that I gave you, it's really, once again, it's a very big spreadsheet. It's hard to go over all the details, but what I give you here in this spreadsheet is a couple of things. I give you the northern kingdom. I give you the northern prophet during that period of time, and then it's then in contrast to the southern kings and the southern prophet. So it's northern kings. Who was the northern prophet at the time? Southern king, and who was the southern prophet at the time? And then I give you a little bit about what the prophets were actually saying. What was their primary message? Give you a little bit of understanding about some of the overlap of the prophets. I can't get all of the information in there, so I kind of just give you a timeline here of when they began, not how long they went. So I just got pretty much just a time period of when they began. And then down here I got a little key for you, and I show you that when it comes to the southern prophets, you had two really great kings. Who were they? Revivalists, Hezekiah and Josiah. I expect you to remember that. I think that's very, very important. If you really want to understand the definition of revival, we learn it from them. Okay? They define revival for us. Of course, Nehemiah and Ezra also define revival, but these guys define revival for us. And then we have 6 okay kings, okay, and then 11 evil kings. So the evil went out big time, right? Mm-hmm. So we got 8 to 11. And then when it comes to the northern kings, all of them were evil. I want you to remember that. I want you to understand why they were evil. I want you to understand they were so evil because of the precedence that was set by Jeroboam. I want you to understand, I want you to know exactly what that evil was that Jeroboam did, because that evil ultimately infects the southern kingdom as well. But they didn't just get it from Jeroboam. They also got it from Solomon. Think about what Solomon did. I want you to think about the Asherah pole, okay, and what that was. It was a very wicked, immoral worship of a goddess of fertility, and I wouldn't want to even get into the details of it. But I want you to understand how they so blasphemed God, and especially in the northern kingdom, because they made God in the image of a bull. And that was the sin of Jeroboam. So there's so much information there to just talk about how many gods actually Israel let in. I believe I put it in my book on the last two kingdoms. There were so many gods that Israel, the northern kingdom, was actually worshiping. Moloch, Chemosh, Asherah, which is also known as Esther, or Diana, or Artemis, the Queen of Heaven is another name that she's known by. But at any rate, I think there was over 50 gods that they were worshiping instead of the one true and living God. So listen, love all of you guys. The final's going to be challenging, but just organize your notes properly, and these things are it's going to be easy for you to do. I'm going to give you basically 4 or 5 days to get it done before you have to turn it in. It's got to be turned in before we start the next quarter. I'll talk about it a little bit more each lecture 8, lecture 9. See ya. Love you.
Pastor Mark, so you said there was 10 years co-regency